Western Front, Normandy, July 1944. Morning mist drifts across hedgerows shattered by shell fire. The smell of cordite and wet grass mixes in the air as distant engines rumble through the fog. On a low ridge, a group of German officers watches through binoculars, confident, amused. From captured Allied reports, they know the Americans rely on radio chatter. Too many frequencies, too many voices. They broadcast like farmers, one officer jokes. Every command overheard, every move predictable. Below them, a column of Sherman tanks snakes along a dirt road, vanishing into haze. The Germans prepare an ambush, standard procedure, perfected through years of precision and discipline. But then, without warning, the Shermans halt, fan out, and split into flanking elements. Mortars open from unseen positions. Infantry advances exactly on cue. Every movement is synchronized, invisible to German ears. Through the fog, the officers hear overlapping bursts of static. Short, coded transmissions on frequencies they cannot decipher. Confusion spreads. Orders jam. Coordination falters. Within minutes, their formation unravels. The Americans hadn't just learned to talk. They had learned to listen, to coordinate, and to strike as one. What began as mockery over primitive radios would end as Germany's most underappreciated defeat: the loss of battlefield communication superiority. At the start of World War II, radios were the unseen edge that separated the hunter from the hunted. In 1939, when German armor poured into Poland, France, and the Low Countries, their tanks didn't just move, they communicated. Each panzer carried a radio set, connecting commanders to platoons, platoons to companies, and companies to the swift-moving spearheads that became known as blitzkrieg. It was a revolution not of weapons, but of words. The German army spoke faster than its enemies could think. French and British commanders, by contrast, still relied on field telephones, motorcycle couriers, or colored flags. Orders were often outdated by the time they reached the front. A German tank officer could shift an entire column in seconds with a single transmission. Allied forces took hours to react. This invisible network became Germany's deadliest weapon. Coordination made even mediocre tanks lethal. During the invasion of France in 1940, German panzer divisions swept through Allied defenses not because of superior armor or firepower, but because of superior communication. Radios turned chaos into choreography. By 1942, as America entered the war, the lesson was clear, but not yet learned. US tank and infantry units trained on outdated equipment and doctrine that emphasized control from headquarters, not real-time flexibility. The standard-issue infantry radios, heavy and fragile, were often left behind in the mud. Many tank platoons had only one working set, usually in the commander's vehicle. If that tank was knocked out, the rest went silent. Early American tanks like the M3 Lee and first-generation M4 Shermans carried radios, but their crews lacked training in tactical radio discipline. Channels were cluttered, signals weak, and interference common. German officers who intercepted Allied transmissions often described them as confused, redundant, and verbose. They mocked the Americans' habit of speaking plainly, even in combat, without encryption. To the Wehrmacht, radio was not just a device. It was a doctrine, drilled, structured, and protected by protocol. Each panzer battalion had designated frequencies and call signs. Messages were short, coded, and rehearsed. Efficiency was everything. American communications, by comparison, seemed amateurish. too democratic, too talkative, too trusting. That confidence led to arrogance. In occupied Europe, German radio operators routinely eavesdropped on Allied frequencies, noting patterns and locations. Field reports mocked the undisciplined chatter of American armor and artillery. One German signal intelligence summary from 1943 concluded confidently, "Their radios speak, but they do not coordinate." It wasn't entirely wrong. In the early North African campaigns, American and British forces often lost contact in the chaos of battle. Radio batteries failed in the desert heat. Wires broke. Static filled the airwaves. Tank platoons moved independently, sometimes colliding with friendly units or losing synchronization during attacks. At Kasserine Pass, miscommunication turned a retreat into a rout. German forces under Rommel exploited this perfectly, dividing, isolating, and encircling Allied groups before they even knew what had happened. Back in Washington and London, analysts studied these failures carefully. The solution wasn't simply more radios. It was a new philosophy. Communication had to become an operational weapon, not just a support tool. The US Army Signal Corps, led by General Dawson Olmsted, began overhauling the system. Factories shifted to mass-produce the new SCR series of radios, lighter, clearer, and far more reliable than their predecessors. The SCR 300 walkie-talkie and SCR 508 tank transceiver became the backbone of modern battlefield coordination. But technology alone wasn't enough. Training had to change. Soldiers needed to learn not only how to transmit, but when to transmit, to speak less, but say more. Radio nets were reorganized into layers: platoon, company, battalion, regiment. Each had its own frequency, and call signs rotated regularly to prevent interception. By 1943, in the fields of Italy, the transformation began to show. American tankers could coordinate artillery strikes in minutes instead of hours. Infantry could request air cover in real time. Engineers could call for recovery vehicles or supplies without halting entire operations. The sound of static was no longer confusion. It was control. Still, the Germans laughed. They believed their command structure, honed by years of doctrine, would remain untouchable. Their signals intelligence units, Nachrichtenaufklärung, continued intercepting Allied radio traffic and reporting to Berlin with confidence. They didn't realize that the Americans were no longer broadcasting chaos. They were building a network that moved faster, hit harder, and thought as one. The shift was invisible, and that was its genius. The U.S. had learned from the enemy, quietly turning Germany's greatest advantage into its coming downfall. Soon, in the hedgerows of Normandy and the forests of the Ardennes, those noisy American radios would become something new: an orchestra of war. By the summer of 1944, communication had become the unseen front of the war. The battlefield was no longer just about guns and armor. It was about the flow of information. Every second mattered. Every message could mean survival or disaster. The U.S. Army understood this better than ever after the bloody lessons of North Africa and Italy. In response, the Signal Corps and Armored Force began working hand in hand with manufacturers like Motorola, Western Electric, and Galvin Manufacturing to refine a family of battlefield radios. Each design had one goal: speed of coordination. The result was a technological leap. The SCR 508 became standard in Sherman tanks, a reliable FM transceiver that resisted static and interference far better than earlier AM sets. For infantry, the SCR 300 walkie-talkie offered unprecedented mobility, allowing platoon leaders to communicate directly with armor and artillery support. For the first time in modern warfare, entire divisions could act as a single organism, each part aware of the other's movement. To German intelligence, this coordination seemed impossible. Their own radio networks, though disciplined, were brittle. The Wehrmacht's famed Blitzkrieg coordination from 1940 to 41 had relied on unjammed airwaves, high-quality equipment, and clear skies. By 1944, Allied jamming, bombing, and resource shortages had eroded that system. Many panzer units were forced to share frequencies, causing interference and confusion. Meanwhile, American doctrine evolved around flexibility. The tank-infantry artillery triangle was no longer theory, it was execution. A Sherman platoon advancing through bocage country could call artillery via one channel, coordinate with nearby infantry via another, and receive air support confirmation from a third, all within minutes. Each net had discipline, brevity codes, and relay units that kept the signal alive even under fire. What had once been mocked as chaos had become precision. In field manuals issued in 1944, communication was described as a weapon equal in importance to firepower. Commanders drilled their men to speak in fragments, concise, coded transmissions. Able read 2, shift fire right, 10. Charlie 3, confirm position, over. Every crewman, from driver to gunner, learned the basics of radio procedure. If one voice went silent, another could take over. To the Germans, who still depended on strict top-down command structures, this adaptability was alien. American junior officers could call in strikes or adjust plans without waiting for higher approval. A flexibility that multiplied their effectiveness. And behind it all stood a logistical miracle. Thousands of tons of spare parts, antennas, and batteries flowed across the Atlantic, ensuring that no unit fought deaf or mute. Communication maintenance teams traveled with divisions, repairing sets under shell fire. The Signal Corps even devised waterproof radio housings for amphibious operations, critical during the Normandy landings, when salt water and sand destroyed anything unprotected. By D-Day, the difference was measurable. German coastal defenses relied on wired lines that were easily cut by bombing or naval shelling. When those lines went down, their command posts went silent. American and British units, by contrast, maintained radio contact throughout the invasion. Ships to shore, tank to infantry, artillery to observation plane. The scale was staggering. More than 120,000 radio sets operated simultaneously during the Normandy landings, the largest synchronized communication effort in military history up to that point. German intercept officers were overwhelmed. Their monitoring stations, already short of trained linguists, reported that Allied traffic had become too fragmented and coded to exploit effectively. One frustrated German intelligence officer wrote in his July 1944 report, "Their chaos has become harmony. We no longer understand them." As Allied forces pushed inland, radio nets expanded like veins across the French countryside. Every armored division carried mobile command vehicles equipped with multiple transmitters and frequency maps. The fog of war, once an inevitable curse, began to lift. Still, the transformation was not without sacrifice. American tankers and radio operators paid dearly for the knowledge that made this network work. Every transmission carried risk. German direction-finding units could triangulate a signal in minutes. Radio operators often changed positions mid-battle, stringing wires through hedgerows, hiding antennas under branches. Some units used decoy signals to lure enemy fire away from real command posts. Yet for every setback, the system learned. Adjustments were constant, innovation relentless. The Americans had turned radio warfare into an evolving science, and soon that invisible science would manifest in something visible. Something terrifying to German officers who had once mocked it. Entire Sherman battalions moving like water, converging on ambushes and flank positions with perfect timing. By the time the Battle of the Bulge began, Germany's last great offensive, the U.S. Army's radio net was the most sophisticated battlefield communication web the world had ever seen. It connected not just men and machines, but minds. It was no longer about who fired first. It was about who heard first. War is not only fought with bullets and armor. It is fought through understanding. By 1944, the American Army had learned that communication itself was a form of intelligence, but its mastery came through many angles: human, tactical, technological, and psychological, all converging through the hum of a single frequency. Inside a Sherman tank, the radio wasn't just equipment, it was lifeline. In the noise of engines and explosions, it was the one thread that kept a crew connected to the outside world. A gunner couldn't see more than a few degrees through his sight. A driver saw only steel. The commander's voice, crackling through the headset, was both direction and comfort. Early in the war, many soldiers distrusted the devices. Radios overheated, batteries failed, signals cut out mid-battle. Crews relied on hand signals, flares, or shouted commands. Primitive gestures in modern war. But by mid-1944, with the SCR-508 in nearly every Sherman and the SCR-300 in every infantry company, those doubts began to fade. Young radio operators, often just out of high school, learned to speak a new language. Short words, clipped tones, no emotion. Fox Blue 3, target right 200. In that brevity was survival. To outsiders, it sounded impersonal. To those inside the net, it was intimacy, the sound of trust. Every transmission was a heartbeat. When a call went unanswered, silence meant loss. Crewmen later recalled that even static could feel human. "If I could still hear them," one operator said, "they were alive." The true revolution wasn't that American forces had radios. It was how they used them. The doctrine shifted from isolated transmissions to coordinated radio nets. Each unit operated on designated frequencies, layered like an invisible hierarchy. Battalion commanders, platoon leaders, and air controllers shared structured channels that kept operations fluid, even amid chaos. In Normandy's labyrinth of hedgerows, this new network became decisive. Before the war, a tank and infantry company could take hours to synchronize attacks. Now, it happened in seconds. When Shermans encountered an ambush, infantry units heard it instantly and adjusted. Artillery could fire based on coordinates relayed in real time. Air support, often P-47 Thunderbolts, could be summoned with a phrase, "Danger close. Grid 5-6. What seemed like chaos to the Germans, dozens of American voices overlapping, was actually controlled simultaneity. Units learned to transmit in rhythm, like musicians keeping time. A commander at headquarters could picture the entire battle unfolding through radio chatter alone. To German observers, the effect was disorienting. Their own panzer units relied on rigid sequences, orders down, reports up. The American system pulsed in all directions. Even when individual officers were killed, operations continued seamlessly. The Germans called it Kampf aus der Luft, battle from the air, as if the Americans fought through invisible clouds of coordination. Behind the front lines, the Signal Corps had built a miracle of engineering simplicity. The SCR-508 tank radio was compact, shock-resistant, and used frequency modulation, a leap over the German AM systems that suffered static and signal bleed. FM kept American transmissions clear, even amid artillery thunder. The radios were easy to repair with interchangeable parts, a deliberate choice for field usability. The infantry's SCR-300 walkie-talkie weighed nearly 35 pounds, but soldiers carried it proudly. For the first time, a platoon leader could talk directly to tank commanders and artillery observers without leaving cover. The connection between armor and infantry, long the weak link of warfare, became seamless. Equally vital was logistics. Radios were mass-produced, modular, and supplied with spare components in every convoy. Unlike the German Fuji sets, which required specialized crystals and precision tuning, American radios could be replaced and retuned on the fly. The system valued functionality over finesse, a pattern that mirrored American industrial philosophy itself. Each success in the field validated the design. When the 2nd Armored Division coordinated multiple battalions across 10 miles during the breakout from St. Lo, German intelligence called it impossible under battlefield conditions. They didn't understand that for the Americans, radio wasn't a support tool. It was the battlefield. German signal intelligence, once the envy of Europe, now found itself blind. The Americans' shift to decentralized radio discipline destroyed the predictability on which German monitoring depended. Intercept stations that had once eavesdropped, easily on Allied chatter, now heard. Brief bursts of coded brevity, meaningless fragments, that vanished before triangulation could occur. Panzer officers began to complain of phantom coordination. They would engage one Sherman company, only to be flanked by another appearing from the tree line within minutes. Infantry attacks arrived synchronized with artillery barrages as if by magic. To German analysts, it seemed that the Allies had developed an entirely new method of warfare. In reality, it was nothing supernatural, just synchronized communication. What Germany had in engineering, America had now matched in organization. The Reich's high command had underestimated the democratic chaos it mocked. Each American voice on the radio was not disobedience. It was initiative. Captured German officers would later admit their disbelief. "We thought they were disorganized," one colonel confessed in 1945. "We didn't realize that every man was his own commander." The human mind craves connection, especially in war. In the cold and mud, a voice over the radio could mean safety. It was proof that someone still commanded, that someone still fought beside you. For Allied soldiers advancing across Europe, the sound of a calm operator. "Hold your line, reinforcements inbound," carried more weight than any speech. It meant they weren't alone. The Germans, long accustomed to silence and hierarchy, began to feel the inverse. Their radios brought only top-down orders or frantic distress calls. Communication became fear, the sound of panic bouncing through static. American troops, meanwhile, turned it into rhythm. The crackle of the radio became background music to battle, familiar and constant. It gave structure to chaos, confidence to confusion. By 1944's end, the U.S. Army had achieved something the Axis never had. A battlefield where every soldier, from general to rifleman, could share a common voice. And soon, that voice would echo across France, Belgium, and the Ardennes, turning the tide not with armor or artillery, but with unity of sound. In earlier wars, leadership had been about presence, a commander visible on horseback, waving a saber, shouting orders above the din. In World War II, leadership became invisible. It traveled through radio waves. By 1944, American commanders no longer needed to stand on ridges or crawl through mud to direct battles. From command half-tracks fitted with the SCR-299 or the newer SCR-399 mobile radio stations, generals could speak directly to units miles away. Yet this didn't mean control became rigid. It became fluid. U.S. doctrine emphasized mission-type orders, clear objectives, flexible execution. Patton's corps commanders could assign goals. Take that ridge, secure that town, and trust subordinates to decide how. The radio allowed for this freedom because contact was never lost. A lieutenant could report, adapt, and adjust within moments. This philosophy baffled the Germans. Their Auftragstactik, once the model for initiative, had decayed under Hitler's obsession with centralized command. Radios in the German army had become tools of control, not empowerment. Hitler often demanded to approve battlefield decisions personally. By contrast, American networks gave authority downward. Each signal from a field radio wasn't just a message, it was a transfer of trust. That trust turned the Allied advance into something the German war machine could no longer match: a living, responsive organism. And for the first time in military history, communication itself was a form of democracy in motion. Behind every crackling voice on the front was a factory back home, running day and night. Between 1942 and 1945, U.S. industry produced more than 900,000 battlefield radio sets, 32 million spare parts, and enough wire to circle the Earth several times over. Motorola's engineers in Chicago worked under blackout curtains, their designs evolving faster than the military could issue manuals. Western Electric and RCA developed modular circuit systems, meaning a broken unit could be repaired in minutes instead of hours. Each advancement shortened silence. Tungsten and copper shortages forced innovation. Aluminum substitutes, new soldering methods, smaller vacuum tubes. By 1944, the average tank radio weighed half as much as its 1942 counterpart, but had double the range. Factories became tuned to the same frequency as the battlefield. Posters on assembly lines read, "Every part you solder saves a soldier." Many engineers and line workers kept shortwave, sets tuned to BBC or Armed Forces radio, listening to the same. Static their creations were cutting through. Overseas, this synchronicity between industry and frontline utility created a cultural shift. War production was no longer distant from combat. It was combat, waged through innovation and efficiency. The hum of America's radio factories was the echo of its advancing armies. And when German officers laughed at American mass-production radios, they didn't understand that quantity and quality had fused. For the first time, a weapon of precision was being built at the speed of industry. Every message broadcast had a listener. And by 1944, America had learned to use that truth. Alongside the tactical nets that coordinated attacks, there existed a shadow network. Radio intelligence units. These teams intercepted German transmissions, decoded call signs, and triangulated positions with handheld direction finders. In France, units like the 3251st Signal Service Company operated behind advancing divisions, their trucks filled with oscilloscopes, receivers, and code charts. They listened constantly, not to command, but to understand. What they discovered was devastating for the enemy. German communications, once flawless, had become chaotic under constant pressure. Encryption keys were reused. Frequencies overlapped. When fuel shortages grounded liaison aircraft, many tank divisions relied entirely on radio reports, which made them easy to track. American intelligence officers began cross-referencing intercepted chatter with front-line movement. Within hours, they could predict where panzer battalions would strike. This information flowed through the same networks that directed tanks and artillery. A closed loop of intelligence and action that Germany could neither match nor break. Ironically, the same arrogance that had made German officers mock American radios now exposed them. Their disdain for noisy communication had blinded them to its strategic potential. By late 1944, U.S. field commanders were reading the enemy's intentions almost as fast as they were formed. The radio had become not just a weapon of coordination, but of foresight. In the chaos of total war, communication wasn't only strategic, it was moral. Every voice that reached across static reaffirmed something vital: that soldiers were seen, heard, and remembered. When a tank went silent, the loss was felt like the extinguishing of a heartbeat. Commanders often risked exposure just to confirm a crew's fate. "Can anyone hear me?" became more than a phrase. It was a plea against oblivion. The Germans, trapped in rigid hierarchies, began to experience isolation. Orders came down but rarely returned upward. In bombed-out villages and snowy forests, their silence deepened. American troops, meanwhile, filled the air with messages, jokes, songs, and codes. Fragments of life woven into war. A captured German operator once remarked bitterly, "Their radios never stop talking. It's like they're alive even when they're dying." He was right. That was the point. For America, communication became the antidote to fear. In the loneliest corners of the front, static carried the sound of humanity. The radio nets of 1944 were more than military tools. They were the blueprint for modern warfare. Each field transmission created a small data point. Each coordination between armor, infantry, and artillery formed a miniature network. Together, these systems represented the first real-time, integrated command structure in military history. What began with the SCR-300 and SCR-508 would, decades later, evolve into digital command systems, satellite links, and GPS coordination. The lessons learned in the mud of France became the foundation for Cold War and 21st-century communication doctrine. The concept of network-centric warfare, often credited to modern technology, had its birth here, in the hedgerows and forests, where American soldiers learned that knowledge moved faster than steel. And yet, none of it began with computers. It began with voices, calm, deliberate, human, cutting through static, turning chaos into order. By late 1944, that order had become a weapon all its own. The Germans could still build great tanks, still plan ambushes, still strike hard. But their enemy could now think, react, and respond as one. The war had entered a new dimension, the realm of synchronized thought. And soon, as autumn turned to winter, that synchronization would face its ultimate test, when German confidence collided with the sound of American coordination echoing through the Ardennes. December 1944, the Ardennes. The forest slept beneath a sheet of snow, muffling the sound of engines that hadn't yet started. To the Germans, this was their final gamble. Wacht am Rhein. The counteroffensive meant to split the Allied front and force a peace on Hitler's terms. Panzer divisions, Tigers and Panthers gleaming under frost, crept toward American lines. In Berlin, generals believed surprise was total. Allied intelligence, they thought, had gone deaf. Their radio silence, their night marches, their encrypted plans, all of it would mask the coming storm. They were wrong. From Luxembourg to Liège, American radios were already alive. The US Signal Corps had built a web of communication so dense that no sector stood alone. Every artillery battery, tank platoon, and infantry battalion was tied to a shared net. What looked like scattered divisions on a map was, in reality, a single organism, capable of feeling, reacting, and adapting faster than any German offensive could unfold. On December 16th, at dawn, the first shells fell. The sky thundered as German artillery opened fire across an 80-mile front. Trees splintered, roads cratered, snow turned black with smoke. For a moment, chaos reigned. Lines were cut, positions lost, units scattered. But unlike 1940, the Americans didn't collapse. They talked. Within minutes, field radios crackled to life. Ardennes Command, this is Able Red 2, under fire, Sector Baker. From a half-track in Bastogne, a communications sergeant relayed the message up the chain. Signal trucks outside Verdun retransmitted across frequencies, filling the airwaves with movement reports, artillery calls, and reinforcement requests. The Germans, who had expected silence, instead heard a storm of voices. Clipped, confident, relentless. They realized too late that they were fighting an enemy that could still coordinate while under attack. As German armored columns advanced through the forest, their radio discipline began to fray. Static-filled channels, snow-clogged antennas. Batteries died in the cold. Panzer commanders switched to prearranged frequencies, only to find them jammed or overlapped. The US Signal Corps' counter-interference units flooded enemy bands with noise and false orders, confusing entire formations. Meanwhile, Sherman units on the defensive formed impromptu radio nets of resistance. Tanks in different companies, even divisions, linked through open channels, a breach of protocol in peacetime, but a miracle in war. One commander at St. Vith later said, "We didn't fight as battalions. We fought as one long conversation." That conversation changed the course of the battle. At Bastogne, where the 101st Airborne became encircled, radio operators worked without sleep. The SCR-300s they carried through snow and shell fire maintained contact with artillery batteries miles away. When supplies ran low, it was the radio that summoned airdrops. When ammunition ran out, it was the radio that guided gliders through the fog. German officers, confident that their encirclement had succeeded, were baffled by the continued American resistance. They didn't realize that Bastogne wasn't isolated. It was speaking constantly to every corner of the front. Elsewhere, in the north, the 2nd and 3rd Armored Divisions coordinated a counterattack near Celles, using tank radios alone. Columns separated by miles of forest advanced with the precision of a single unit. Panther at crossroads, grid 4107, engaging. Seconds later, copy, fire for effect, artillery inbound. The call went from tank to relay to gun battery to sky, and within minutes, Shells fell exactly where they were needed. The Germans, dependent on runners and unreliable field phones, could not replicate this speed. The fog and forest that once gave them cover now trapped them. Their own communication network, designed for lightning offense, buckled under defense and retreat. Captured German operators later admitted that they could hear American coordination. Short, efficient bursts of sound they couldn't decode. It felt, one said, as if we were fighting ghosts who always knew where we were. Those ghosts were the US radio nets, alive, responsive, self-healing. When antennas froze, soldiers improvised with field wire or used tank hulls as grounding points. When batteries died, they scavenged from wrecks. The network refused to die. It was the unseen backbone of the Allied stand in the Ardennes. By Christmas, the German advance had stalled, not only because of fuel shortages or weather, but because the Americans had turned communication into armor. Every voice on the radio meant another unit still fighting, another point of resistance refusing to break. General Eisenhower would later describe the victory as a triumph of control amid confusion. What he meant was that America had mastered the art of staying connected under pressure. The Germans had brought their best tanks, their most elite divisions. But the Americans had brought something far more powerful: the ability to think as one, no matter the storm. In a war where information traveled at the speed of a sentence, that was enough to turn disaster into discipline and defense into dominance. The Ardennes marked more than the failure of Germany's last offensive. It proved that the battlefield no longer belonged to the army with the most guns, but to the one that could make every gun speak the same language. And as the winter fog began to lift, that language, the calm, clipped tone of an American operator over a Sherman net, would soon carry eastward, across the Rhine, and into the heart of Germany itself. By early 1945, the tide of the war had reversed completely. The German army, once the model of precision and control, was now fragmented, drowning in its own silence. The Allies, meanwhile, were speaking louder than ever, not through propaganda, but through synchronization. The voice of American radio nets followed every movement east. When Patton's Third Army broke the siege of Bastogne, it wasn't sheer momentum that carried them forward, it was coordination. Thousands of vehicles, from tanks to trucks to artillery haulers, moved across frozen roads in near-perfect unison. Orders rippled through the air, not paper. Road clear, advance. Enemy armor retreating north. Bridge secure, proceed. The Germans had no countermeasure. Their field lines were destroyed, their encrypted Enigma transmissions increasingly intercepted or delayed. Many units fought blind, unaware of neighboring divisions' positions. Commanders described the front as a black wall, where they could no longer sense the shape of battle. The Americans, by contrast, saw everything, not visually, but audibly. Through radio reports, they could reconstruct the battlefield in near real time. The sound of the war had changed. It was no longer the roar of engines or artillery, but the rhythmic exchange of coded words that kept an army alive. When the Rhine River became the next obstacle, the radio once again led the charge. In March 1945, as Allied forces approached Remagen, they discovered the Ludendorff Bridge, still standing, though rigged with explosives. The Germans had failed to detonate it in time. Within minutes, American forward observers relayed the discovery through battalion frequencies. The report moved up the net like an electric current. Bridge intact. Repeat. Bridge intact. Within hours, Engineers, tanks, and infantry converged, all guided by radio coordination. The first crossing into Germany wasn't the result of luck. It was the result of communication speed. Before the Germans could react, before Luftwaffe bombers could strike, the bridge was secured across the Rhine. The same frequency that had once carried static now carried triumph. It was here, in those crucial days, that German officers finally understood their failure. Their beautifully engineered tanks, their legendary discipline, all had been undone by something they couldn't measure with calipers or blueprints. Information flow. Captured records from the German 15th Army revealed despair. One report read, "The enemy moves faster than our orders can reach. Their command appears to exist everywhere and nowhere." That everywhere was the network, an invisible battlefield that America had mastered. Even the US Air Force, once operating separately, had become integrated into the same communication chain. Tactical air controllers worked directly from tank radios, guiding P-47s and P-51s onto targets within seconds. The once separate worlds of sky and ground now spoke the same language. When a Sherman platoon pinned down a German convoy near the Ruhr, the commander radioed coordinates to an air controller just half a mile behind. "Eagle 1, this is Red 2, armor at grid 7-2. Copy, Red 2. Thunderbolts inbound. Keep your heads down." Moments later, the sky erupted. The coordination was surgical, a level of precision unthinkable in 1942, now routine by 1945. To the Germans, the radio waves themselves had become a weapon, intangible yet unstoppable. Their last hope, the famed Panzerlehr and Hitlerjugend divisions, fought with bravery but in isolation. Units that once prided themselves on discipline were now reduced to fragments, surrounded and outmaneuvered by an army that seemed to think collectively. The sound of the battlefield, once filled with German orders barked through static, had become dominated by the clipped English of Allied nets. Advance. Confirm. Copy. 3 words that moved nations. In Cologne, where the 3rd Armored Division pushed through the ruins, tanks advanced street by street under radio guidance. Spotters on rooftops fed coordinates directly to tank gunners below. It was urban warfare at a new level of control. When a German Panther ambushed the lead Sherman, the command to flank and destroy came over the airwaves within seconds. A tone of calm amid the chaos. "Right 2 blocks. Fire when ready." Moments later, the Panther burned. War correspondents following the campaign were stunned. "They fight as if they're one machine," one wrote in Stars and Stripes. He was right, but the machine wasn't metal. It was made of voices. Each one of those voices, from the Signal Corps operator stringing wire through rubble, to the tank commander in his headset, to the pilot circling above, formed part of a living organism that the Germans could no longer comprehend. Hitler's engineers had perfected the art of building. America had perfected the art of connecting. By April 1945, when Allied forces encircled the Ruhr pocket, the pattern was complete. German columns that tried to escape were instantly detected and trapped. Direction-finding trucks triangulated transmissions in minutes. Air and artillery coordination annihilated movement before it began. Inside one intercepted message, a despairing German officer wrote, "We no longer fight soldiers. We fight their signals." He was right in ways he didn't yet understand. The battle of machines had become a battle of messages, and the side that spoke fastest had already won. The same radio nets that carried calls for fire and movement now carried something else, surrender negotiations. The same frequencies that once directed Sherman attacks now guided German prisoners to collection points. The airwaves themselves had shifted from war to peace. In those final weeks, amid smoke and ruin, American troops advancing through German towns heard a strange quiet. Not silence, but the hum of radios everywhere, transmitting coordinates, status reports, supply requests. To them, it was the sound of victory. Not a shout, but a signal. The Battle of the Bulge and the Rhine crossing had proven one truth beyond question: the side that controls. Communication controls the future, and as Germany's grand war machine fell apart in mechanical silence, the American network hummed on, steady, calm, unstoppable, carrying its final message across Europe. The age of command was over. The age of connection had begun. By the spring of 1945, Germany's empire of noise had fallen silent. The war that had begun with the thunder of blitzkrieg ended with the whisper of radio static fading over ruined cities. The same airwaves that once carried orders for conquest now carried surrender codes, evacuation calls, and the quiet coordination of a world learning how to rebuild. The Luftwaffe was grounded, the Wehrmacht fragmented, and within every shattered German command post, one absence was more striking than the wrecked vehicles or scattered papers: the silence of dead transmitters. To the Allied soldiers advancing through the Rhine Valley, victory was measured not just in territory, but in communication. Each American unit could still hear its neighbor. Every tank crew, infantry platoon, and supply column remained part of one vast system. The living, humming pulse of Allied command. For historians, the victory at this stage was often described as industrial, the triumph of production, logistics, and numbers. But beneath the tonnage and output figures lay something subtler: the triumph of conversation. Every message that reached the front shaped the outcome. The US Signal Corps alone had relayed more than 350 million messages between 1942 and 1945. Orders, warnings, calls for aid, and silent codes that changed the course of battles. When tanks rolled across bridges or aircraft bombed precise coordinates, it wasn't just power at work, it was information made kinetic. The Germans, for all their engineering genius, never recovered from losing their ability to listen. Their once feared Nachrichtenaufklärung, signals intelligence units, were blind by 1945, overwhelmed by frequency hopping, coded brevity, and the sheer volume of Allied transmissions. Captured German engineers examined the American radios they had once mocked and were astonished by their durability. "They are not beautiful," one admitted during post-war interrogations, "but they always work." That was the difference. Germany built art. America built rhythm. The results were visible everywhere. In the coordination of armored spearheads across Bavaria, in the synchronization of bomber escorts over the Ruhr, and in the way wounded men were evacuated through networks that never slept. Even as Europe burned, the American communication net endured, expanding, adapting, improvising. When the German surrender finally came in May 1945, it was delivered fittingly through radio. At 2:41 a.m. on May 7th, a coded transmission left the German headquarters in Reims, confirmation of unconditional surrender. The message traveled across the same frequencies once filled with arrogance, now reduced to quiet obedience. For Allied troops, the radio crackle announcing "the war in Europe is over" was more than relief. It was validation, that the invisible threads of coordination, the static-filled lifelines that had guided them from Normandy to the Rhine, had held firm until the very end. In the wreckage of Berlin, American and British technicians found elaborate but useless German communication centers. Copper torn from walls, antennas melted by bombing, switchboards frozen in place. The Reich had tried to command through precision. The Allies had conquered through adaptability. But victory brought a new challenge: how to maintain connection in peace. The same systems that had guided tanks and aircraft now turned to rebuilding, delivering food convoys, guiding refugees, organizing reconstruction teams. The airwaves that had once carried orders of war now carried the beginnings of recovery. The Americans had not only defeated the German war machine, they had replaced its silence with structure. Communication had become civilization's first step toward healing. As the Allied armies occupied Germany, the full scale of the collapse became clear. Factories stood silent, rail lines twisted by bombing, power stations gutted. But more telling than all of it was the absence of coordination. The Reich's once vaunted command structure had disintegrated into static and rumor. For a regime built on total control, the loss of communication was fatal. American engineers and Signal Corps officers toured the ruins of Wehrmacht communication centers from Cologne to Munich. They discovered elaborate telephone switchboards, cable networks, and beautifully crafted Enigma machines. But none of it mattered. When the bombs fell and supply lines broke, these systems failed. Germany's perfectionism had become its weakness. Every piece was too specialized, every fix too slow. By contrast, the Americans had fought with improvisation as doctrine. A destroyed antenna was replaced with a wire strung between two trees. A tank's hull became a ground node. A field operator could rebuild a transmitter from spare parts in the mud. The Allied radio system had evolved beyond any single device. It was a living network of human adaptability. Captured German generals, interrogated after the war, expressed disbelief at how fluid and decentralized the American command had become. "We could never understand," said General Hasso von Manteuffel, "how your units kept fighting after being cut off. Our units died with their orders. Yours made new ones." That was the legacy of the Sherman nets and the broader Allied communication revolution. It was not about one machine or one battle, but a philosophy. Empower the individual operator, and the Army never stops thinking. In Washington and London, military theorists quickly realized what this meant. The future of warfare wasn't in stronger armor or faster engines. It was in information. The lessons of 1944-45 laid the foundation for the coming decades. Tactical radios evolved into battlefield networks. Encryption advanced into early data systems, and the concept of command transformed forever. The U.S. Army established the Signal Research Laboratories at Fort Monmouth, studying everything from frequency agility to battlefield cryptography. Their goal was clear. Never again should a nation lose a war for lack of communication speed. Even in civilian life, the echoes of wartime radios endured. The engineers who built SCR transmitters went on to pioneer television broadcasting, radar navigation, and early computing. The same principles that had allowed a Sherman tank platoon to coordinate through chaos now powered the post-war communication age. In Germany, meanwhile, post-war reconstruction brought a different kind of awakening. Former German radio engineers, now working under Allied supervision, helped rebuild the civilian infrastructure they had once helped destroy. One remarked in 1946, "The Americans taught us that connection is stronger than command. Across Europe, the quiet hum of rebuilt transmitters symbolized not just recovery, but transformation. Information, once a weapon, had become the bridge to peace. Back home, American tankers who had survived the Ardennes and the Rhine crossings often recalled the strange comfort of radio static. "As long as you heard that hiss," one veteran said, "you knew you weren't alone." It was a small sound, almost invisible in the grand machinery of war. Yet it represented everything the Allies had learned. Technology alone didn't win. Communication did. And as the world moved into the atomic age, that lesson would define the next century. The war had begun with the crack of rifles and ended with the whisper of voices across static. Voices that refused to fall silent, that linked men across miles of ruin and fear. It was proof that in modern warfare, survival belonged not to the strongest, but to those who stayed connected. When the guns fell silent in 1945, Europe stood in ruins, cities flattened, empires erased, and millions gone. Yet amid the wreckage, one invisible legacy endured: the network of connection that had carried men through the darkest hours of the war. The story of the Sherman nets and the laughter they silenced was more than a tale of technology. It was a lesson about perception, humility, and the nature of strength. The Germans believed mastery lay in precision, in perfect machines, flawless plans, and rigid control. The Americans believed it lay in adaptability, in making imperfect systems work when perfection failed. A Sherman's armor could be pierced. Its gun could be outmatched, but its voice, the ability to call for help, to coordinate, to share, could not be silenced. That voice became the backbone of an army that refused to break. In every static burst, in every clipped transmission across mud and chaos, there was a reminder that communication is not merely a tool of war, it is the heartbeat of cooperation. Those who mocked its simplicity never understood its power. The Germans built cathedrals of steel. The Americans built bridges of sound. And in the end, it was those invisible bridges, strung between tanks, radios, and human resolve, that carried the Allies from Normandy's beaches to the heart of Berlin. Decades later, the same principles would shape satellites, digital networks, and global communications, descendants of the same field radios that once hummed across Europe. The age of information was born not in peace, but in the crucible of necessity. The laughter of German officers in that foggy French field had faded long before the war ended. In its place came understanding that in an age of machines, it is not silence that wins, but connection. The Sherman nets had done more than coordinate an army. They had proven that unity, the power to think, move, and act as one, is the ultimate weapon. And as history turned its page, one truth echoed across the static of time: those who communicate endure.